Hey everyone, I just wanted to offer a few comments as we close out Module 5. I hope that you're all having a great start to your week, that you're all healthy and happy. Things are going well at my house, so I hope the same for everyone else. In terms of what we were thinking about and reading this week, I enjoyed our comments about periodization, as well as a few other things that I kind of replied back to and asked some questions about on Twitter. I also read through all of your discussion posts. You're doing a great job of asking well thought out, contextualized, open-ended questions. And in terms of responding, providing context as well as evidence and support for your thoughts and your answers to each other's questions. So please just keep up the great work. I'm very happy about the way that this course is going, and I am learning a lot from your insights on revolution. I enjoyed thinking about the idea of periodization. That's probably a made-up term that only historians use, but it is the idea that we have to decide when we are going to come up with some sort of project, whether it's a book project or an article, whatever research it is we're doing, we have to decide where's the beginning point and where's the end point. What's the period that we're talking about? There's not necessarily a right way to do that. There may be less effective ways to do that. I'm not going to say wrong because, again, I don't know that you could really be wrong in terms of choosing a period. You might be super arbitrary rather than well thought out, but again, that is what it is. But that's something that we're thinking about over the last couple of weeks. And I appreciated the comments that a few of you offered thinking about the difference between the long scale context that we read in the case of the Chinese Revolution. The time frame wasn't necessarily the depth of the context in the case of the Cuban Revolution last week, of course, as we talked a little bit about. I wrote a little bit about in my blog post for last week. But the kind of layering of different categories, thinking socially or social scientifically, I guess, if we want to say it that way. Of course, Pérez Stable is a social scientist. She's a sociologist, and so she's thinking about things like how the economy, how political situations, how foreign interventions all layer onto each other. And she's using a lot of data and that kind of quantitative information as well as a bit of qualitative information to tell the story of the Cuban Revolution. We had a little bit of different perspective this week, thinking about Russia and Mexico. I do have to admit, and I think I've probably said this before, and you've gotten this from my intro in our course, I'm much more familiar with the case of Mexico than I am with any of these others, although I have studied the others as well. So that said, we have a book by Michael Gonzalez on the Mexican Revolution that gives us just like 2.5 pages of introduction. The introduction from Fitzpatrick was a little bit longer than that, but not too long. Both of them actually made nods toward the historiography of their respective revolutions. That's another of those terms that historians use. Historiography, if you're not familiar with that term, is essentially thinking about how historical interpretations and perspectives have changed over time. So the way that scholars looked at the Mexican Revolution in the years just following it is drastically different than the ways that they are looking at it now. And just to give a quick overview of that, it went from kind of looking at the revolution as a heroic major change for Mexican society and major gains for the populace to a much more cynical kind of revisionist view of the revolution as not having changed much of anything at all, to kind of pushing back in the other direction, seeing elements of both, so not necessarily just looking at the revolution as a heroic, it did everything for everyone kind of thing, because of course it didn't. It had major limitations, and it instituted what Mario Vargas Llosa called the perfect dictatorship in the one-party state presided over by the PRI. So if you're not familiar with those things, those are topics that will come up as we continue. Um, so again, my point is that these authors make references to those ideas. They even make references to some of those authors. So for example, Gonzalez referenced Alan Knight, who is one of the major names in the historiography of the Mexican Revolution. His book on the revolution is 2 volumes, super heavy, 1,000 pages altogether, and it's seen as one of the major syntheses of the revolution. John Mason Hart wrote one of the other major syntheses of the revolution that came out in the mid-'80s, both of them did. And they take different tacks. Hart looks at foreign intervention from the United States as one of the key factors of the Mexican Revolution, and he looks at kind of the global comparative situation in ways that Alan Knight does not. Alan Knight wants to see the revolution as more or less a self-contained phenomena that's based more in Mexican history and the kinds of stresses that were placed on the Mexican people due to things like foreign economic dominance. So he doesn't discount that completely, but he's saying this isn't a foreign thing. This is a Mexican thing that was happening. And so those arguments, they're based on some nuance, but they're very interesting to kind of tease out and think about the differences. All of that is underpinning Michael Gonzalez's quick survey of the Mexican Revolution. Similarly, that's the case for Sheila Fitzpatrick with the Russian Revolution. She makes nods to things. One that quickly comes to mind from what we read for the last module is her mention of past historians thinking that the morale of the Russian troops during the First World War was far lower than it actually was. That was the story for quite a long time. That morale, that everyone was sort of against the World War in Russia, that wasn't quite the case. And she points out, too, that kind of paradoxically, at the same time that Russia was trying to modernize and was drawing on capital, infrastructure, and technologies from the West, it was also building an empire. I mean, it was an imperial, I was going to say nation. I guess that's the correct term. It was an imperial state, and it was looking to expand beyond its kind of traditional holdings just around Russia, what became the Soviet Union, even as it was struggling, even as the Tsarist system was on the decline. And so that's an interesting kind of phenomenon to look at with Russia. We also have to think about ideologies. The Russian Revolution is pretty straightforward because we can say Marxism was the ideology for that revolution. However, as Fitzpatrick points out, there were these other radicals. They were socialists in their leanings. 19th century socialism had all sorts of manifestations in Europe. And so that's what she's kind of drawing on and talking about there. My whole point here is just to say there's a lot underpinning these shorter duration treatments of their respective revolutions that we don't necessarily get a grasp of or an understanding of because they didn't take the space, these authors didn't take the space to explain them. That's one thing we might lose from this shorter durée. The long durée, though, as so many of you pointed out, is also easy to get lost in just because there's so much context. And it's almost as if the context is given more weight than the actual revolution. At least that's kind of how it hits me. So those are things that authors are trying to balance as they set up their research projects. These are things to think about as you set up your own research project. Of course, you're not writing a book, but you do need to think about how the topic you choose and how the questions you ask will shape the kind of research that you will be doing, that you'll be able to do, and the kind of project that will come out of that. So I've referenced John Mason Hart's work. I'm going to post an article. It's actually the middle chapter from the book that I mentioned, his synthesis of the Mexican Revolution. So if you're interested in that, please give it a look. It's in a chapter length. I mean, it's kind of a dense chapter, but it looks at the Mexican, Chinese, Russian, and Iranian revolutions around the turn of the 20th century. And he's trying to think about global causation. That's what the title of that chapter is. I think that may fall a little short, but I think the comparative aspect is important. to think about, again, what constitutes a revolution. How do those things manifest differently from place to place in the world? So again, if you have the chance, please look that over. It might be helpful as we continue forward with our study of those various revolutions. Also, I've posted a draft of a chapter that I will be publishing. It's going to be published in an anthology coming out hopefully within the next year with the University of North Carolina Press on the U.S.-Mexico border and its histories of violence. But it talks about, it examines the revolt led by a man named Santana Perez against the customs house in the small border town of Palomas, Chihuahua, just across from Columbus, New Mexico. And I think it sheds some light into that notion of Serrano or agrarian revolts versus the actual Mexican Revolution. So what were the things that kind of led up to the revolution? It gives a different picture than maybe a lot of the things that we've already read do. So again, please give that a read and let me know what you think. I appreciate learning from your insights, and I hope that you have a great week. And please don't hesitate to ask questions whenever you have them.